It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, after all these years, the JFK assassination still has this pull, this sense that we're not getting the whole story.
Yeah, and with all these new documents coming out, that feeling, it just grows stronger, doesn't it? Like,
Yeah.
what have they been keeping from us?
Exactly. It makes you wonder, what did the government know back then, right after it happened, that they didn't want us to see? And that's what we're digging into today.
Right, we're taking a deep dive, a real close look at these documents from 1963, the stuff that was flying around the CIA in the days right after the assassination.
We're going beyond the official investigations, right? This is the raw intel.
Exactly. A lot of it's coming from the CIA station in Mexico City. And what we're trying to figure out is this. What do these files tell us about what the government knew about people connected to Lee Harvey Oswald?
Before November 22nd, 1963. Before it all happened.
Precisely. Like, who were they watching and why those particular people?
So let's jump right in. One of the first names that pops up is Benito Ruiz Chaguacera. There's a memo, November 19th, 1963, just a few days after the assassination from Mexico City, and they're requesting what they call Traces and Personnel Operations Analysis, POA, on this guy. Born in Cuba in 1908, became a U.S. citizen in 1930, gave up his Cuban citizenship. And here's the interesting part. His job is listed as the manager of a local branch of, the American Society of Travel Agents, ASTA.
Wow. Right. Like days after the assassination, they're on this, and they're really specific.
Yeah, it's not like they're just casting a wide net.
It makes you think, why? Why a travel agent?
Yeah.
Especially one with ties to Cuba right after the president's killed.
Well, travel agencies back in those Cold War days, they weren't always just booking vacations.
Right. Sometimes they were facilitating, well, let's just say other things. Could he have been helping people of interest? Maybe even someone connected to Oswald?
And they knew a lot about him. No kids, a brother named Simon living near Havana, even a grandson in Miami. They even noted he was a degree Mason.
Huh. A Mason. That would have raised some eyebrows back then. Lots of conspiracy theories about the Masons.
And get this, he was the only delegate from Cuba at the ASTIA convention in Mexico City, end of October. So just a few weeks before Kennedy was killed.
Mexico City, Cuba, a travel agent, right before the assassination. That's a lot of coincidences.
It is. So was he just flagged because of his Cuban connection? Or was there something more specific about him?
Maybe his being at that convention, right, in Mexico City. It's like they were looking for something very particular in those first few days.
Like a needle in a haystack.
Yeah, exactly. Think about it. You're in the middle of a crisis, right? You're trying to put the pieces together. They were probably looking at travel patterns, anyone who might have crossed paths with Oswald, any connection to Cuba. Cuba was a huge concern back then.
Right. The Cuban Missile Crisis was just the year before.
Still fresh in everyone's minds. Okay, so then we have Jorge Antonio Abasolo Garcia, a document from November 23rd, 1963, also Mexico City. Same request, traces, and POA, but way more detailed than with Chaguacera.
Yeah.
This one feels like they already had their eye on this guy.
Yeah, this one's different.
He's a Cuban industrial engineer, born in 1927, graduating from Georgia Tech.
So he had a U.S. connection?
Yeah, they had his address and phone number in Havana, even details about his divorce, his ex-wife, and kids living in Miami. You don't just stumble across that kind of information.
It's like they had a file on him already.
Right. It's not like a random check.
Yeah.
It gets more interesting. He was the chief of division in the Ministry of Industries in Cuba, working closely with, wait for it, Che Guevara.
Che Guevara.
He was overseeing the wood furniture industry, part of the paper and toy industries, and something else, but they don't specify what. And he had had contact with the Soviets about getting cement.
So he was a big deal in the Cuban government, dealing with the Soviets, and close to Che Guevara.
High-level stuff. And that would have sent alarm bells ringing in Washington. This is the height of the Cold War, right?
Right.
So the question is, were they already watching him before the assassination? And what were they looking for? Economic intel, tech stuff, maybe even political maneuvering?
So it looks like they were very interested in what was going on in Cuba.
Definitely. Okay, the document also mentions he thought the Soviets were building a submarine base in Cuba.
Whoa, huge if true.
Which was a major fear at the time. Think about it, Soviet subs right off the coast of Florida.
That would have been a nightmare scenario for the U.S.
Exactly. So this guy, Abasolo Garcia, he had traveled to Mexico in August, just a few months before, on a special passport to see his kids. But his ex-wife stopped the visit. He went back to Cuba on August 21st.
So a recent trip to Mexico on a special passport.
Yeah, and remember, he was worried about a Soviet submarine base. That means he had access to some pretty sensitive information in the Cuban government. Even a personal trip like that, It would have raised flags, especially with him being who he was. You have to wonder if the U.S. knew about the trip beforehand.
Maybe they even tried to talk to him while he was there.
Possible. Now here's the twist with Abasolo Garcia. He had a brother, Gustavo Abasolo, living in Mexico. And this guy, he was described as strongly anti-Castro, a friend of something called Am-Sever II. They communicated through the Netherlands embassy diplomatic pouch.
So a secret line of communication.
Right. And listen to this.
Yeah.
The intelligence station, they asked A2, who turns out to be Gustavo, to get certain information from Jorge. Jorge said maybe, but he wanted to know how far they wanted him to go.
So the U.S. was trying to get intel from inside the Cuban government.
It sure looks like it. A high-ranking Cuban official, close to Che Guevara, has an anti-Castro brother in Mexico. And this brother's working with U.S. intelligence using a secret back channel.
That's incredible.
Right. And the diplomatic pouch, that's serious business. They didn't want anyone, not even U.S. intelligence, to know what they were talking about.
Like a spy novel. So what was this certain information? Do we know?
No, they don't say, but it had to be important. And the document goes on, Jorge was thinking about leaving Cuba by the end of the year, wasn't happy with the regime anymore, and the station thought maybe they could convince him to stay.
Maybe recruit him.
Yeah, maybe. The document also says his ex-wife's mother, she remarried a communist. This guy was the former chief of security service in Havana, recently promoted to something even bigger.
So they're keeping tabs on everyone in the family.
They're trying to build a complete picture, and all of this info, it came from Gustavo Abasolo. He was their man on the inside. So you've got this whole network, right? A high-ranking Cuban official, his brother working for the U.S., a secret communication channel. It's amazing. And all happening right as Oswald's in Mexico City. It really shows you how deep the U.S. was in the intelligence game, especially when it came to Cuba.
They were watching Cuba very closely.
Definitely. And let's talk about that Che Guevara connection for a minute. Document 104-10093-10109 says very clearly, Jorge Antonio Abasolo Garcia worked closely with him. Guevara, I mean, he was like a rock star of the Cuban Revolution.
One of the most famous revolutionaries of all time.
A huge thorn in the side of the U.S. So anyone close to him, they would have been a target for U.S. intelligence. It was like having a direct line into the enemy camp.
And they were worried about Cuba doing what?
Oh, all kinds of things. Support for revolutionaries in other countries, maybe even attacks on U.S. leaders.
Wow.
So they were watching Abasolo Garcia's every move, trying to figure out what Cuba was up to. Now, Gustavo, the brother, we know he was anti-Castro, talking to Jorge. Document 104-10093-10266. Just 2 days later, November 25th, it gives us more details about what he was up to. It talks about these meetings he had with someone called Amos LV2, late October, early November.
So right around the time Oswald's in Mexico City.
Exactly. You have to wonder if they saw a connection, even if it was indirect. The document says Gustavo was talking to Che Guevara all the time, probably through Jorge. And it says Jorge wanted to leave Cuba, partly because he wanted to support his kids.
So he was caught between his family and his country?
Yeah. This later document, it also tells us how that secret communication worked, the one with the diplomatic pouch. Gustavo would give letters to his niece at the Netherlands embassy in Mexico. The outside envelope was addressed to a Cornelis Beach post at the embassy in Havana, and inside, another envelope for a guy named Cabanes, who worked for Jorge, and he'd deliver the letters.
Complicated.
Right. They were trying to be super careful. They didn't want anyone to intercept those messages, not even the Cubans.
Or the Americans.
It's a fascinating insight into the world of espionage. So the whole setup was pretty elaborate. The mention of Cabanes as former diplomat, anti-Castro, that adds another layer to the operation.
Right, a whole web of spies.
Exactly. Okay, so A2, that's Gustavo. He knew Cabanes. Older guy, not doing so well, going blind. He used to own a printing business. Gustavo even sent him medicine through the pouch system.
That's kind of sweet, actually.
Yeah, well, they were risking their lives. So you've got this high-ranking Cuban official, his brother working for the U.S., and this former diplomat, all caught up in this secret communication network. What were they talking about? Was Gustavo giving the U.S. information about what Cuba was planning? Yeah. Was any of this on their radar before the assassination? So many questions.
And the answers are probably still buried in some file somewhere.
Yeah, probably. Okay, so let's move on to something else interesting from these documents. We found these lists of people in Mexico in documents 104-100-00075 and 104-100-00075 and 104-100-0161, along with some pictures.
Lists of names. Sounds pretty dry.
Yeah, but there are a lot of names. It suggests a huge intelligence operation going on in Mexico.
Like they were tracking everyone.
And a lot of the dates are from around November 1963. which makes sense, right?
So right around the assassination.
Yeah. Now, we don't know exactly why these people are on the list, but the fact that they exist, it tells us the U.S. was gathering a lot of information in Mexico City right at that time.
Mexico City was a hub of activity.
It's right between the U.S. and Cuba, a real hotbed of espionage. So those lists could be anyone, people they were watching, informants, maybe just people they were keeping tabs on.
Like a who's who of potential threats.
Maybe. And this makes you wonder, was Oswald on one of those lists?
Was he being watched too?
It's possible. They were probably trying to track as many people as they could, trying to find connections, potential threats. Remember, this is the Cold War. Anything could happen.
The stakes were very high.
They definitely were.
Yeah.
Okay, we also found this document, 104-10095-10276, from way before the assassination, September 20th, 1960. It's about this audio surveillance operation in Havana, codenamed STESCALADE. They were targeting the new China News Agency office.
The Chinese.
Yeah, this was before the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the U.S. was already doing some shady stuff in Cuba. And they even got permission from the U.S. ambassador. They even used an embassy employee to do the surveillance from her apartment.
So they were really serious about spying on the Chinese.
Absolutely. They sent technicians and equipment from the U.S., set it all up in this woman's apartment back in November 1959. By June 1960, they thought the Chinese might have more communications gear in other rooms, so they put in more microphones and recorders in another apartment. They even got a separate apartment just for taking pictures.
Wow, a whole spying operation.
They were gathering intel any way they could. So the question is, were they doing the same thing to other people or groups in Cuba or Mexico, people who might have been connected to Oswald? Because they clearly had the means and the will to do it.
So they were probably watching a lot more than just the Chinese.
I think so. Now, this STESCALADE thing, it didn't always go smoothly. The landlords got into trouble. They had to cancel some contracts, and 3 of the technicians got arrested and kicked out of Cuba.
So it was dangerous work.
Yeah, risky business. But it shows you what they were willing to do to get information. They were constantly trying to gather intel using all sorts of methods.
Some more successful than others.
Exactly. Okay, one more document. 104-100-1070, December 6th, 1963. Very short, but interesting. It just says that letters should be sent to an Angel Guadalupe Rivera at an address in Mexico City. And then a note. Requested Mex Crystal Psi provide letter drop for T Crystal 1.
A letter drop, like a dead drop.
Exactly. They're using a code name, T Crystal 1. Definitely some secret squirrel stuff going on here. We don't know who this person was or what kind of information they were sending.
But they needed a secret way to communicate.
Even after the assassination, Mexico City was still a major hub for intelligence activities.
So who was using this letter drop and what were they sending? Was it about the investigation or was it something else entirely?
It's hard to say, but the timing is very suspicious. Okay, last one. Document 104-19077-100077 from Mexico City, December 16th, 1963. It says that a Jerzy Plebanski was traveling to Dallas on December 15th for an international symposium. He was coming back to Mexico City on the 18th. The source is PBSIRC, and there's a note saying, review Gobernacin file. Plebanski had permission to leave Mexico for conferences in the U.S.
So the CIA knew he was going to Dallas.
Yeah, and the Mexican government was keeping an eye on him too.
So he was someone they were both interested in.
He was on their radar, that's for sure. He was going to an international symposium. Sounds harmless enough. But they wanted to look at his file.
Maybe he had done something in the past, or they thought he might be involved in something.
Right. We don't know for sure, but it shows you how carefully they were watching anyone who had connections to Mexico,
Right.
especially after the assassination.
So stepping back a bit, what does all of this tell us about what the government might have known about the JFK assassination? What were they hiding?
Okay, a few things stand out. First, they were looking at a lot of people right away, like Benito Ruiz Chaguacera, the travel agent with ties to Cuba. Then there's Jorge Antonio Abasolo Garcia, the Cuban official who was close to Che Guevara and all that stuff with his brother in Mexico. That tells us they were worried about Cuba, and they were already trying to get information from inside the Cuban government.
And they were using some pretty elaborate methods to do it.
Yeah, diplomatic pouches, secret letter drops, the whole 9 yards. They even had an operation to spy on the Chinese in Havana. So they were definitely willing to get their hands dirty.
And they were watching people travel to Dallas even weeks after the assassination.
Yeah, like Jerzy Plebanski.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to know who was coming and going. So these documents, they don't give us all the answers, but they paint a picture of a lot of intelligence activity focused on Cuba and Mexico before and after the assassination.
So there are still a lot of unanswered questions.
Definitely. Who was the government watching? What do they know? And what were they trying to keep secret? We're just starting to scratch the surface.
It's a fascinating puzzle.
And these documents are just a few pieces. If you're listening to this and you're as intrigued as we are, I encourage you to check out these newly released documents yourself. There's a lot to unpack, and each piece helps us get a little closer to the truth.
Exactly. And remember, intelligence work, it's all about secrets. So we have to be careful about how we interpret these documents.
Think about the context, what was happening in the world at the time, and why the government might have been doing these things.
It's like a historical detective story.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, think about this. What if the big secrets about the JFK assassination, they're not hidden in one document, but scattered across all these different files? What if it's about all those seemingly unimportant people they were watching and those hidden lines of communication? These new documents tell us that we don't have the whole story yet. Not even close.
There's still so much more to uncover.
There is.
And that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating.
Absolutely.